So this is gonna be a video debunking the arguments of a coping, seething, no good, very bad Nazi that I found who frivolously decided to try and fail to critique and debunk Hunter Avallone's arguments when he was debating with that room temperature IQ Celsius dumbass James Hake. To introduce Sean last, if I could describe him in one sentence, he's basically the literal embodiment of the quote by W.C. Fields that goes, quote, "If you can't dazzle them with brilliance, baffle them with bullshit," unquote. The entirety of his terminally online career involves heinously ripping statistics and certain quotes of studies out of context and straight up fabricating data in order to substantiate Nazi talking points unsuccessfully. However, his charlatanism does well with people who aren't willing to critically analyze data and just nod along with every last bell curve talking point he spouts. In this, I'm gonna debunk every repudiation he tried to make against Hunter and just see why it falls flat, because even though he can try to make it appear as if studies make his point, if you actually read either the conclusions or the abstracts of them, you'd see that they falsify the point he's trying to make. Now first off, it's not gonna be my typical response video style, because the original was an hour long and that would be an absolute slog to edit. Also, it's gonna be a departure from the typical editing style you see on this channel, so if you don't like videos that look like an insomniac college kid's last-minute PowerPoints, don't watch this. So I'm gonna go point by point and try to compile results from every study he brought up that I can at least get my hands on. He tries to bring up one study to make the claim that housing administrations didn't discriminate based on race. However, the study he flashed on screen for a few seconds, which was behind a paywall I might add, directly invalidated that claim. A few seconds later, he brings up another study and fails to debunk Hunter's argument. He makes the claim that blacks were overrepresented among those who were given home loans, but that doesn't refute the fact that housing discrimination was practiced in Philadelphia, because the conclusion itself said, quote, "There is substantial evidence to indicate that private lenders and the federal government practiced housing discrimination." Urban historians point to the disinvestment in central cities, high levels of racial and economic segregation, and disparities in housing quality and home ownership across race in the second half of the 20th century as a result of earlier lending, unquote. As I've said, the best way to falsify claims these race realist types make is to look at the conclusions of their studies to realize what they show aligns with a leftist perspective. He brings up another study, which is again behind a paywall, claiming loans weren't racially disparate, but the reason he's harping on loans specifically so much is that the study proves the existence of redlining. Fascists must deceptively misrepresent the evidence to prove their points because they don't tell the whole truth. In the conclusion of this paper, the author states, quote, "The analysis show that the statistically significant variables in both housing submarkets are income and neighborhood risk factors. However, although racial concentration is not statistically significant and racial change is positively associated with mortgage lending, this does not conclusively refute the hypothesis that redlining exists," unquote. Now that your evidence is only proving Hunter's point and mine, that's 3 studies you've lied about so far, Sean, so your Pinocchio nose should have grown a parsec by now. No wonder you don't show your face. Any more evidence you're gonna lie about or fabricate that I could instantly debunk? Of course! In another paywalled study, he claims that redlining didn't exist on the basis of race. However, the screenshot Sean took was a hypothetical that could have possibly been conjectured from the sample. In the conclusion, however, the study states, quote, "In addition, the acceptance rate for home improvement loans is also significantly lower in racially heterogeneous neighborhoods than in neighborhoods whose racial composition is mostly white or black. These results strongly support the hypothesis that some forms of redlining take place on the basis of the racial composition of the neighborhood," unquote. Yet another lie. He brings up another paywalled study which again disproves his claim, saying, quote, "As the general trends for old blue-collar and minority neighborhoods indicate, the Old City minority group and North Highlands neighborhoods of Sacramento did not receive high levels of lending. The upper middle-income suburb studied received far more loans than any of the other neighborhoods," unquote. Then Sean tries vacuously again to disprove Hunter's point and fails with his evidence proving the opposite of what he's saying. In directly disproving Sean, the author states, quote, "We showed that the PSID samples from grandparents to adult grandchildren fit the story of the age wealth profile with a few exceptions. We also find that families have vastly different wealth positions in the age wealth profile. Typically, white grandparents have higher wealth positions, while black grandparents have lower wealth positions in net worth and financial asset ownership. These racialized positions in net wealth and asset types in one generation are then renewed in the next 2 generations. Descriptive statistics provide preliminary evidence that there are intergenerational forces at work, forces that help to stratify the American population into wealth groups, unquote. For a guy calling himself a race realist, you sure don't want to present what exists in the reality. He also brings up another study trying to say that black people don't experience disparate intergenerational wealth transfers than whites, despite the fact that right in the abstract it says, quote, "We also document the stark disadvantage of African American households in terms of not only their wealth attainment, but also their intergenerational wealth mobility compared to whites." Now that Pinocchio observation I made earlier seems really prescient now, since I couldn't fathom how anyone could be this cartoonishly dishonest. In an interesting change of pace, Sean brings up a bar graph that could honestly just double as a stock image of a bar graph, seeing how frivolously truncated and uninformative it is. Take a look at this. What is this? By what metric are you measuring wealth? Why didn't you label the axes? Where did you get the sample from? What's the margin of error? If this is a reproduction of an original study's results, can we see the original data? I'm making a mistake, thinking you're creating actual scientific results, so I'm gonna assume this is another white nationalist Excel fabrication. Interestingly, he tries to bring up a table to pass intergenerational wealth off as something related to genes, but the stats for America don't relate to race or any specific demographic. They relate to control variables that someone doing the math could factor in. You're proving nothing by showing this, and your desperate attempt to somehow link the aggregate US stats to race won't last long under my watch, Sean. Subsequently, he brings up a screed of studies that ever so conveniently haven't been linked and only list the name, dates, and findings of the papers. I'd really love to see them, Sean, but I'd never experienced transparency with Nazis, which is odd because I thought you people want to become whiter than ghosts. He then brings up a summary on inheritance, which I've completely invalidated. After a slew of prevarication and tergiversation, Sean brings up a quote from Pew trying to explain that test scores can predict racial wealth disparity. However, in the very same screenshot, it refutes this hypothesis, saying, quote, "It is also worth highlighting that among these who finished 4 years of college, there is no racial gap in upward economic mobility. Both whites and blacks in this group experience very high rates of upward economic mobility," unquote, which inadvertently proves it's their environment that predicts economic mobility and not genetics. I'm beginning to think you're not only dumb and deaf, but blind as well, since you just can't see what's right in front of you. And knowing how many genetic defects some of these Southerners have, I wouldn't be surprised if your parents cowgirled you into existence knowing they were related. Poor Southerners' environment determines that because they have less ubiquitous access to education, meaning it's their environment. And if you think what I just said is racist, I'm white. Then we transition into whether or not blacks experience hiring disparities, for which he brings up another text wall trying to claim that blacks get fewer callbacks because of their names, despite the fact that the abstract he cited doesn't mention anything about names and only mentions race. He then brings up BLS stats, says that it takes black people longer to get jobs, despite the fact that the BLS don't mention race, and in a fatuous attempt to cope, Sean says the study design doesn't make any sense. He doesn't go into detail as to why, and then moves on to the next study that disproves his point. Then there's another one of these. The illustrations I love the most. Not because of what they say, but the fact that they're not fooling anyone besides Nazis because they're actually dumb enough to believe this shit. From which study did you get this? How are you quantifying density? How are you quantifying job performance? Who holds this threshold and what purpose does it serve? I'm gonna assume this is another Nazi Excel generated lie. This shatters when critical thinking is applied, which fascists are incapable of. He shows something similar after that, and since two can play at this game, look at this bar graph I got from a study. What is it? Trust me, bro. See? Ha! Anyway, Sean brings up a survey to make it look like no matter how much education minorities get, they're always less literate than whites. So long as we're throwing around studies, let's stop using your own against you because it's time to bring up mine. US News says, quote, "On average, schools serving more minority populations have less experienced, lower paid teachers who are less likely to be certified. A report from the Center of American Progress found that a 10 percentage point increase in student color at a school is associated with a decrease in per pupil spending of $75. $5. Disparities in course offerings mean students of color have fewer opportunities to challenge themselves with more difficult courses. The type of courses needed to prepare for a 4-year college degree for a high-paying career in STEM. In 7th and 8th grades, black make up 16% of students, but account for 10% of students taking Algebra 1 and 9% of students passing the course. While nearly 1 in 5 white students took calculus at high school, 1 in 15 black students did. Fewer black students have access to a full range of high school and math and science courses: Algebra 1, Geometry, Algebra 1, Calculus, Biology, Chemistry, and Physics. They are underrepresented in gifted and talented programs. Black students take fewer advanced placement courses than white students and score lower on AP tests. Unquote. I love when you think you can paint yourself as the master race when you just end up falling into a leftist trap. Additionally, he cites another piece ripped out of context in order to make it seem like black people intrinsically produce less, despite the fact that according to this NIH article, blacks experience higher rates of psychological distress than whites, so how do you expect them to be more productive? He brings up another tome trying to point out that race isn't a substantial hiring decision, but the study focused specifically on police departments in white neighborhoods. Hunter only mentioned hiring practices broadly and not specifically police. It's ironic how you fascists love strongmen, but hate steelmanning their opposition. He then goes on to bring up a quote from a book, meaning I can't find greater context, that says many thought it was easy to get a minimum wage job. However, Sean extrapolates a wildly different conclusion, saying race wasn't a factor when the quote said nothing about race. His claim is so blissfully ignorant of the fact that racial discrimination in hiring is happening even at the earliest stages, mentions another text wall and tries to factor in cognitive ability when controlling for the wage gap, but in the implications section of the study it says, quote, more broadly, we believe that the nation's most pressing social concern should be the poor school performance and exposure to violence of many low-income minority and central youth. The costs to these children in emotional pain and blighted opportunity are immense. To incorrectly attribute the lost earnings of these children to an increase in racial discrimination is likely to direct attention away from the school and family failures that are its real cause, unquote, expressly stating that it's not an increase in discrimination but environment that screw with cognitive ability. What's he gonna lie about next time? He brings up another paywalled study which was published by a known pseudoscientific quack who was condemned by 68 different evolutionary psychologists for publishing garbage research in quack journals. Either way, the sample controlled for a 10-word vocabulary test as an indicator of cognitive aptitude. Who the fuck actually thinks the shit is valid in any way? And even Sean sounds like he had some skepticism going into this. After flashing a summary, which I've yet again debunked, as none of Sean's points pertain to reality, he shows a table that actually proves Hunter's point made in the debate when he said predominantly white schools are funded more than minority schools. In yet another gratuitous attempt to cope, he pivots from funding and talks about teacher experience when he puts up a table that has figures relating to black schools, completely omitting white schools. After that, he cites fabricated data from the Heritage Foundation that cites the Department of Education statistics. However, I couldn't find race-based funding data anywhere on their website, so I'm gonna assume that's more Nazi garbage. After all, it's literally Heritage. You can especially tell he's seething and malding because he's citing charlatans and think tanks at this point. He then attempts to pass up mean estimates and control factors as a figure that would reduce the disparities to statistical significance. However, literally nothing on the table says anything about significance because that would be indicated by the character alpha. He also falsely claimed that whites and minorities will be treated the same way depending on the severity of the crime, but minorities get shot at far greater rates for non-fatal assaults. It's just false. He flashes yet another screed of findings and names alongside the dates, but again he doesn't mention the title nor has he provided the sources for this video, so I'm again gonna write it off as more Nazi copioids. He then shows an abstract that shows when you control for confounding variables, blacks actually use cocaine and weed at lower rates than whites, which invalidates Sean's counterpoints. He then flashes another abstract, thinking it proves that black people engage in more risky purchasing behavior, but this factor wasn't controlled for along with any other confounding variables, and this study only provides a single factor that could be analyzed in the future. There's another study he shows involving stop and frisk rates, which disproves Sean's point right in the abstract and prove Hunter's point. He also cites an abstract after that, which weighs to a leftist narrative saying, quote, we found that black drivers were less likely to be stopped after sunset when a veil of darkness masks one's race, suggesting bias in stop decisions. Furthermore, by examining the rate at which stop drivers drivers were searched and the likelihood that searches turned up contraband, we found evidence that the bar for searching black and Hispanic drivers was lower than that for searching white drivers. Finally, we found that legalization of recreational marijuana reduced the number of searches of white, black, and Hispanic drivers, but the bar for searching black and Hispanic drivers was still lower than that for white drivers post-legalization. Our results indicate that police stops and search decisions suffer from persistent racial bias and point to the value of policy interventions to mitigate these disparities, unquote. He copes and seethes afterwards about the study because he considers any evidence that disagrees with him to be flawed. In typical Nazi pastebin fashion, he flashes up another article on screen that's specifically about the New Jersey Turnpike, trying and failing to use that alone to refute Hunter's point, coping and seething in the process. He again copes and seethes, writing off the data from a paper Hunter cited, saying that since there was an asterisk, it might be out of date by modern standards of social science. He proves absolutely nothing, because the study was done before that new standard was introduced. Sean then obfuscates and prevaricates around the results of a paper, trying to say the data is inadequate. However, these studies, in their very abstracts, just keep on refuting him. It's ironic that he accuses Hunter of cherry-picking data when he brings up a study that only took a sample from Tennessee and Pennsylvania. What a mauled. Even more deceptively, he cites a study from Georgia that he says accounted for IQ as a control variable, despite the fact that I can't find it anywhere, and he brings up another fabricated bar graph. If you don't believe that he straight up makes up these infographics, he literally admitted it to me on Twitter and then blocked me because I kept on posting the conclusions to the studies that debunked his horseshit. One wall of findings with names and dates later, again, he hasn't added the sources, he deceptively tries to say that this meta-analysis showed race wasn't a predictor of sentencing length, blatantly ignoring the abstract that says, quote, specifically, this study shows that certain methods of classifying racial groups may mask the true effect of race on sentencing decisions. The implications of this finding for future research are discussed, unquote. More coping and seething isn't gonna prove you more right. Additionally, Sean looked at 3 studies from Sweden, claiming that there were no associations between child family income and subsequent violent criminality and substance misuse once they had adjusted for unobserved familial risk factors. However, Sweden is a country with a much stronger social safety net than America, which absolutely explains the difference in crime. You're still presenting me with bullshit. Sean then brings up another screed saying that because unsuccessful Italians left, and somehow tries to debunk that systemically induced poverty has nothing to do with this, despite the fact that it literally does. Again, he's just emphatically wrong. He also tries to substantiate that being from a broken home doesn't substantiate being more prone to crime, despite the fact that he literally says, so? Yeah, he literally makes the point that he's trying to refute. Wow, he's so deluded in pages of Mein Kampf that even he doesn't understand what points he's making and what points he's trying to refute. He then hopes he's explained why Hunter was wrong about everything, and the video ends. At the curtailment, Sean last, the utter idiot that single-handedly proves race has nothing to do with IQ, because if this is the white race, I think we all might have less net intelligence than I previously thought, has been utterly demolished by Hunter Avallone without Hunter having to lift a finger. Sean has proved literally nothing in bringing up evidence that contradicted the points he was trying to make, lied about the data, has cited known liars and condemned charlatans, and has made himself look even dumber than I thought he was. I've tarred, feathered, crushed, and humiliated you. Congratulations. By making this video, you've flattened everybody's bell curve. Well, I hope you enjoyed that, folks. We'll be back in about 2 weeks.